Well, for more on this, let's talk with Professor Geoffrey Garrett, the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. He joins me live now in the studio. Professor, good to see you again.
My pleasure.
What do you make of this changing of the story by the US as to what they tell the public in regard to the killing of Bin Laden? We now find out that while he may have resisted, he was unarmed and he didn't use a female as a shield.
It certainly doesn't look very professional, Scott. Changing the story overnight just doesn't look very good. I think the thing that I'd be most concerned about at the moment is the way that this leaves the US vulnerable to a charge, let's say, from someone like Muammar Gaddafi, that the US engages in assassination. He was a weak old man. He was unarmed. He wasn't trying to resist. They didn't try to capture him. They killed him. And then, Gaddafi could say, that's what they did to my son, and that's what they want to do to me. I've always told you that the West was so evil. This is evidence of it. Of course, we don't hear that in the West. No one's I don't think anyone talks assassination here, but you'd imagine in the Muslim world, it's certainly a whispering campaign.
Well, the whole question of catching him alive has been raised in the West, notably by the eminent QC Geoffrey Robertson, who said by putting him on trial, Osama Bin Laden would have been demystified. How much would have this been a huge debate and argument in the hours, days, weeks leading up to this operation? Do we catch him alive? Do we kill him?
Well, of course, we don't know we don't know what the resistance was like and what the situation was like in the room. Did they really have a choice? But I think if you think through the possibilities of a trial, it would have been extraordinary in two senses. On the one hand, as soon as he was captured, presumably any Islamic extremist would have been trying to capture Westerners and Americans to hold them hostage and say we need Osama bin Laden released. But if you think about the other big issue in the US, can you actually have one of these trials? Barack Obama said he was going to close Guantanamo Bay and put the people accused of the September 11 bombings on trial in the US. 2.5 years later, he's had to back down from that because even a city like New York with Michael Bloomberg, the mayor says, listen, we can't have that kind of trial here. It's just too dangerous. So it sounds good, I think, in theory that, boy, if we used a Western legal procedure that would strip bare any mythology about Osama bin Laden, but I think the practicalities of that would have been extraordinarily difficult.
The whole question of the release of the photo of bin Laden's body, what's your reading of it? Could it potentially calm and clarify things, or could it, as the White House spokesman said, be potentially inflammatory?
I think the inflammatory end is the cautious way to go on that one. If we think back to the early days of the Iraq War, the photos of brutality, and mostly psychological brutality against Muslims who were being held at Abu Ghraib, as you'll remember, was an enormous global story and really provided a rallying point for Islamic extremists. I think that's what the US would be worried about today. I don't know what would, yes, there'd be certainty, but I remember from the early reports they were talking about DNA samples from bin Laden and the like. You'd think there might be other ways to do it other than a photograph, although Leon Panetta said that he thinks a photograph the head of the CIA might be forthcoming.
On the whole question as well of trust, or the apparent lack of it, in the US-Pakistani relationship, senior US officials, including the CIA chief, has said that, well, no, we didn't tell the Pakistanis. We didn't want to potentially jeopardise the mission. But a former Pakistani general has told the BBC that the Pakistani military would have certainly known about this operation that the US conducted, and that they've just been left out of the picture publicly so that Pakistan doesn't have to pay a huge political price. How do we make our way through these opposing views, and what does it say about this relationship?
Well, I think what it tells you is that the United States, and in fact the whole West, is in a diabolical position with respect to Pakistan. You can't isolate Pakistan, you can't invade Pakistan, you probably can't withdraw aid from Pakistan, but at the same time you know that the country is close to ungovernable and that your relationship with them is probably not one that can be based too much on trust. Nonetheless, you just can't walk away from the country, and it's been like that for a long time. I think this event just sheds a very bright light on what's been a very difficult reality going back before this president to President Musharraf, and really back to the September 11 terrorist attacks in the beginning.
And yet a glass half full view, a State Department official was quoted in the Washington Post today saying this creates a new opportunity to begin real negotiations. Now, in light of that comment, I mean, how could this lead to improving US-Pakistan relations?
Hope springs eternal there. You know, I'm not sure how that would actually play out. You know, I think if you go to a slightly broader scale, you might see that the big arc of the Obama presidency has been to try to de-emphasize the kind of in-your-face unilateralism of the Bush administration. We've seen it in Iraq, we're seeing it in Afghanistan. Maybe there's an opportunity to have more constructive dialogue with Pakistan, but I doubt anyone's holding their breath for that.
Let's look across the border for a moment. What impact is this likely to have on the Afghanistan campaign for the US, particularly in its strategy and that all-important date of 2014 of handing over to local security?
Well, there's also a mid-2011 date. Barack Obama, remember, said, I'm going to surge in 2009, 2010. I'm going to begin the withdrawal in the middle of 2011 with an end date, everybody out, 2014. I think that's actually a pretty intense debate in the US as to the impact of Osama Bin Laden's death, because you could see it going two ways. The right, the sort of supporters of military intervention, finish the job in Afghanistan, would say this gives the mission new credibility and new impetus, so let's recommit to finishing in Afghanistan. But I think the more likely course of action is that Barack Obama says, I was right all along to be thinking about withdrawing from Afghanistan, and this only makes it easier for me to do so because one of the fundamental reasons we were in Afghanistan is no longer there.
And I guess all of that debate will feed into the 2012 presidential elections, which are about 18 months away. Even given it is that far away, how do you think this whole event will play into the Obama campaign for re-election and the public's perception of Barack Obama?
Yeah, not surprisingly, Obama has received an immediate bounce up in the opinion polls. I think that was entirely predictable. Will that continue or will it dissipate? It'll probably dissipate, and we'll go back very soon, I think, to the bread and butter economic issues in the US, debt deficit, what's Obama doing about it, what would the Republicans do? But I think Obama now has an ace card in his pocket. Any time someone on the right criticizes him for being soft on foreign policy or indecisive, he says, I not only got out of Iraq ahead of timetable, undoing Bush's mistake, I did what George W. Bush said he wanted to do but could never do. I got Osama.
It'll be an interesting 18 months. Professor Geoffrey Garrett from the US Studies Centre of the University of Sydney, I thank you for your time.
My pleasure.